Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for people who swerve their car into incoming, interesting ideas. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. We all know the story of Robin Hood, plucky archer who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. His band of merry men, a jovial drunk friar, burglaring exploitative aristocrats, redistributing their plunder to the peasants, and then hiding out in Sherwood Forest. Now the whole thing has been pretty much Disney-fied, but it's usually expressed as a sort of socialist morality tale. The rich have too much ill-gotten money, leaving an insufficient amount of money for the poor, so our hero redistributes their wealth. Which is actually a very modern way of thinking about Robin Hood. We basically think of him as Zorro, cosplaying at a Ren fair, the rich versus the poor. But that's not how people in the 14th century would have understood Robin Hood or Sherwood Forest. Actually, let's talk about Sherwood Forest for a moment. I love forests, and I spend a good deal of time poking around them with my trusty dog Wallace. To us modern people, forest means a concentration of trees, right? It's a bunch of trees we can walk around, sling hammocks in, pee on, all that good stuff. Means trees. The word forest and forbidden share the same root. They're both derived from the Latin word forus, meaning outside. And were we to go back to the 14th century, forest was a much more expansive term than it is now, much closer to that original understanding of forest as the outside. The people of Robin Hood's era would have pointed to treeless fields, naked hills, grassy moors, and described them as the forest. And that was important legally, because those lands, those forests, were detailed in the Charter of the Forests, a document you may never have heard of, but was in its day every bit as important as the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta we have heard of. That's the document which established basic protections for nobles against the whims of a despotic king. Trial by jury, no taxation without the consent of Parliament, standard wine measurements throughout the land, that's in there, and so forth. The Magna Carta's historical significance is rightly heralded because so much of the British and American experiments have been the expansion of that nucleus of individual protection against despotism from an original core of noblemen to everybody. The contemporaneous Charter of the Forest was the rights at that time enjoyed by commoners. And here again, I feel compelled to pick apart the language. Today, commoner sounds vaguely insulting. If somebody was talking to me and they referred to me as a commoner, I would kind of feel compelled to hit them. To my American Oklahoman ear, being called a commoner sounds like a put-down. It sounds, you're unimpressive, average, mediocre. I feel I'm uncommon, don't you? But originally the term commoner was not used to contrast common, average people to the uncommon elite. It referred to the commons. The commons is where the word commoner comes from. Commoners were people of the commons, of the forest, and that ancient sense of the word. And these people of the commons had legal rights established in the Charter of the Forest to derive their livelihoods from it, from common lands. The Sheriff of Nottingham might be the local lord, and he might own lots of land, but even more land comprised the commons, where commoners were entitled by law to graze sheep, collect firewood, gather berries, do some gardening, and so forth. But periodically, kings and noblemen would seize the commons and declare it their personal property, chop down all that wood and sell it to build ships, keep the money for themselves, appropriate a common pasture and convert it into their own private property to rent out, depriving the commoners who had previously used it for their livelihood. So now that we've drilled down into those terms and contextualized them, Robin Hood is not the story of a Marxist with a cool accent and a steady hand redistributing capital. capital didn't exist yet, at least not in any meaningful sense. Robin Hood is the story of hereditary thugs punting the boundaries of their personal property in order to usurp the commons. And the people of Sherwood Forest, the commoners of Sherwood, rising up to reassert their historic rights actively hijacked by petty barons. Now, if I sound pretty smart right now, and I'm pretty sure I do, I should admit I learned all of that from the book we discuss on today's program, Plunder of the Commons. But I reached out to our guest, who you'll hear from momentarily and who I quite like, not for a history lesson, but because I find the thesis of his work very interesting and pertinent to modern governance. My guest today, Guy Standing, says that we should not boil down politics to divisions of private property versus state property, that familiar old battle between capitalist and commie. Rather, he posits we ought to think in both of those terms and separately the commons. Now, if you're like me, and you were firmly on the capitalist side of that aforementioned scrum, you might be suspicious of this delineation. Isn't the commons just a euphemism for the community, for the state, taking other people's work? It certainly could be, but I think we can come up with instances where we would describe something as not exactly private nor public. Radio waves, for example, come to mind. As big a fan of entrepreneurs as I am, as much credit as I want to give entrepreneurs, nobody makes radio wave designations. It's not like radio waves didn't exist and KOMA built 98.9 FM, all oldies all the time. They're producing the radio signal, but that bandwidth, that spectrum that they're operating on, that's just there. But I wouldn't say that radio waves are the state because those designations are licensed by the state. I wouldn't really call radio waves hertzes and whatnot, 98.9, 90.1. I wouldn't call that state property. I would say that's the commons. Or how about this? I camp, as I said, in forests, but sometimes I camp on Bureau of Land Management land if I can't find a decent forest to sling a hammock and pee in. That is land managed by the state. So you could call it the commons, and you could say, well, really, it's just the state. But at the same time, state police protect private property. State courts adjudicate private property. But in my mind, the fact that we have cops and courts does not mean private property is really state property. The state can be involved in protecting something without actually being that thing. Actually, I suspect the best way of thinking about the commons for us is not forests, it's lakes. Every 4th of July, one of my friends, he's a foreigner, and he calls 4th of July the lake holiday because from his perspective, everyone in America goes to a lake and has a barbecue. When you go to a lake, and I imagine most people listening to this program have gone to a lake, you can go jet skiing there, you can fish on it, but when I mount a jet ski or I get drunk on somebody's pontoon, I don't think of that lake we're floating on as state property. I guess technically it is, but I don't think of it that way, the way I do the Department of Motor Vehicles or the state capitol or the Department of Education. It's in my mind, that state agency is something different. The lake that I'm getting drunk on is the commons. And the reason this is important, the reason I am so eager to flesh out this delineation with today's guest is that I personally am deeply suspicious of the efficacy and ethical comportment of command economies. I want the state to be fairly minimal in its attempts to manage the economy and the lives of the individuals therein. So in terms of our approaches to welfare, I would much rather have a big national fund that just automatically pays dividends to everybody, rather than a bunch of bureaucrats who determine who gets taxed for what and then passes it out with instructions on how to spend it. It seems to me that making a distinction between the state and the commons is one which furthers my goals of maximizing individual autonomy and minimizing the power of politicians, because as you will see over the course of today's show, the commons doesn't just have to be land, it could be other things. Now, my guest, I think, is coming at this from the exact opposite position. Whereas I am worried about the machinations of the state and the incompetency of the state, I think he's a lot more worried about exploitation of rapacious corporations. But oddly, despite the fact that I think we are coming from polar opposites, there's a surprising amount of overlap between that of an abashedly free enterprise guy like myself and staunch progressives. And the commons is potentially an entirely different way of approaching how we organize and govern society, a distinction which I believe could be productive in how we restructure society, to the mutual satisfaction of tiny government, free enterprise people like myself, and the fiery economic progressives I spend so much of my time locking horns with. An alternative way of thinking, a new way of thinking, right here on The Political Orphanage. My guest today is Guy Standing. He is a professorial research associate at SOAS, University of London, and the author of Plunder of the Commons, a Manifesto for Sharing Public Wealth, which you can find on Amazon or mightyheaton.com/featured, where you can find all of the books discussed in this program. He is also co-founder and co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network and the author of a book similar to the one we're discussing today about the oceans and a forthcoming book on the politics of time. Dr. Standing, a pleasure to talk to you.
It's a pleasure to be talking to you.
So I'm very intrigued by your book because I've spent so much of my political career basically trying to determine what can better handle this situation, the private sector or the public sector. And I generally favor the private sector. You make an intellectual delineation between those two things and a different category that you call the commons. What is the commons and how is it different than private property or the state?
Well, you have to go back to ancient Rome when the new emperor in AD 529, Justinian, decided to call all the lawyers that he knew to create a commission, and they came up with a delineation of 4 types of property: private property, state property, public property if you like, nobody's property, res nullius in Latin, and the 4th one was common property, res commons, which belongs to everybody. And this delineation has gone through to create the base of common law that is the foundation of the United States, the foundation of all democracies, and we preserved the appreciation of the commons in our common law systems. So that's the basis of it. And the commons is something that belongs to all of us. And it belongs to all of us as equals, as commoners, if you like. And a commons is not just open access. It is something that requires a governance system in which you have stewards, the government or the state or the sovereign, whose responsibility it is to respect what in the United States today is known as the public trust doctrine, to preserve the commons and not exploit the commons to the point of depletion, but to pass it on, the commons, whatever they're defined as the commons, to successive generations, the preservation of what's called the intergenerational equity principle. And any steward is required to respect what's called the modern environmental law, the precautionary principle, not take undue risks with the commons. And that is the basis of the commons, but there are different types of commons. There's the natural commons, which we think about, that the resources, the land, the sea, the seabed, the air, the minerals that exist, they belong to the natural commons. But there are also the social commons, and civil commons, and cultural commons, and intellectual commons. And these are inherited as part of public wealth. So what traditionally was a social commons was something that was set up and treated as a commons, an institution or framework, that when people were asked, is it a commons? The test in the Middle Ages was they got the eldest people they could find And they brought them forward and said, is this a commons, whatever it might be? And the test was, if it had been accepted as a commons, and the beautiful phrase was, of time, out of mind, of man. In other words, as long as anybody could remember, anybody alive. But gradually this was converted into 20 years. Under the statute of limitations in Britain in 1623, and it's been accepted around the world, 20 years. So, for example, Britain's National Health Service was established in 1948, and it was established for the whole people of Britain, and it became a commons in 1968 because it had been accepted as such for that period of time. And you can think about many forms in the United States where similar principles have held.
So in the United States, I would think of like the National Forest Service or the National Park System or something like that. That to me strikes me as very much in line with the commons as you describe it and the Charter of the Forest, because they are forests, but sort of this idea that there are public spaces that are accessible to everybody as opposed to like Congress, which is state property, and even if it's the people's house,
right.
It is a government agency, something like that. Can you give other examples of things, maybe in an American... go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you.
Yeah, no. I mean, the classic case in the United States, beyond the ones that you've given, and I totally agree with those that are part of the commons of the United States, community trusts, for example, land trusts and agrarian trusts. And there are various forms of commons that are emerging in the United States as there are in other countries. And it's a very interesting thing because it's not state property and it's not private commercial property. It belongs to everybody and requires a governance system in which everybody can play a role. And it is therefore democratic. And it is a zone of freedom as well. So it's consistent with a broad range of ideological positions or philosophical positions to have a commons. And historically, a commons was treated with great respect. But in the modern era, it's been plundered in various ways, as I describe in the books.
So the idea of there being a commons in terms of natural resources or public land makes sense to me. And I like the idea of that. I'm an avid camper. I'm from the state of Oklahoma, which has massive petroleum resources historically, and yet is one of the poorest states in the Union. Had we treated our petroleum as a commons, that just all the oil in Oklahoma belongs to all of Oklahomans, I think it would have been to the better of everybody else. So I'm with you so far, but you said a moment ago that if basically if a government program lasts long enough, you consider it the commons. That to me, there's no longer a distinguishing property between the state and the commons. If I have a program that's around since 1948, that just becomes the commons. It's no longer the state.
No, I made a point of saying if it's created as a commons, then as long as it's not been contested in 20 years, then it becomes enshrined in law as a commons. That's how it's been treated historically in legislation and in legal tests and so on, right the way through to the US Supreme Court or the top courts in Britain and elsewhere. Those are the tests that if somebody says right to roam on a piece of land, for example, and it has not been contested by the landowner for 20 years or more, then that is a real right that is enshrined in the law. That's the sort of rule that's taken into legal cases. And it's an important principle so that as long as it hasn't been contested for 20 years, then it becomes a commons.
Got it. So there's sort of two different phenomena that I'm jumping back and forth between. There's an issue of presidential thinking versus the subcategories of commons. And when you're talking about the timing rule, we're referring to the precedent of what establishes a commons and whether something has been contested or not.
Yeah. I mean, there are many examples, and the case in my latest book on the Blue Commons is that traditionally the sea and the seabed were always accepted as the commons. And that became enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982, in which there was a real attempt to stop international rivalry, and particularly at the time the Soviet Union versus the United States, by declaring that the seabed in the deep sea was the common heritage of mankind. We would now say humanity, but mankind was the word that was used in 1982. And the point was to say that it was not a zone for exploitation, commercial competition, and taking of resources, extracting resources, because that would create competitive tensions and so on. And a commons, I think, it's important to stress again and again and again that a commons requires a governance system which allows for different interests, particularly the commoners' interests, to be part of the governance system. It is not state control, and it is not pure capital control. It is our control.
Got it. So when you say governance, and I'm glad that you're italicizing that for our benefit, you're meaning that there has to be somebody that is taking out the trash cans, making sure people aren't littering, making sure that somebody's not building a house in the middle of it. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the state. Like you mentioned trusts earlier. I don't know a lot about trusts in the United States. Sometimes they're run by the government. They might be private cooperatives or just easements on land. I don't really know, but there's some sort of governance that might be independent of the state.
Well, yes. I mean, the idea of the commons, which goes right back through history, is that a commons requires a steward or trustee, whose responsibility it is to preserve the value of the commons, to preserve the commons for the benefit of all commoners equally. And at the same time, we realized that there needs to be what I've called in the books, and some others have called it, gatekeepers. That is, bodies that hold the stewards to account. You can't just have, because stewards could easily become corrupted or could become corrupted, and the gatekeepers, or as bodies, have to hold them to account. The trouble with state control is that there's no gatekeepers traditionally allowed. The same with pure private capitalist control. They can exploit and use their power and so on. A commons is where, built into the system, is a set of balances which ensure that we preserve the commons and pass it on, and any activity in the commons has to meet the principles that I outline in the book of public trust, precautionary, right to habitat, and so on. And that goes right the way back through our history.
Fascinating. So to put this in medieval parlance, insofar as I understand medieval history, private property, if we're just talking about farmland, for example, private property would be like, I am a yeoman farmer, I am something approximating the middle class, and I actually own these 10 acres. They are my land. I farm this land. State property is, I am the king, and I own this county. This county is owned by me. It is my farmland. Whereas the commons would be, it's not that a yeoman farmer owns it. It's not that the king owns it. It's that this is just everybody in this county has access to this land, and it's opened up to everybody, and it's meant to be a big big open endeavor, as opposed to any particular group having control of it.
Yeah, and this goes back to the great philosopher of private property rights, John Locke. John Locke said that, yes, people could have right to private land, private property, subject to provisos that sufficient access for others should be left, and sufficient and enough and of similar quality is left. So if you have an enclosure, as what has happened in the Middle Ages and in time immemorial, where certain interests take all of the land or take all of the resources, and turn it into pure private profiteering, that is an illegitimate plunder of the commons. So the enclosure movements of the Tudors and right the way through the Victorian ages in Britain, for example, where they took millions of acres of land and then converted it into the ownership of a few private property owners who hadn't done any real work to get it, was completely illegitimate. And you can say the same with the sea and the same with other resources, and there's been a lot of that sort of plunder. And I think it's very important in thinking about the historical emergence of the commons to go back to the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. And what happened was that these two documents, which were sealed together alongside each other in Westminster in November the 6th, 1217, to be precise, were the foundation stones of all democracies subsequently. And what the Magna Carta, which the United States Constitution and the founding fathers of the US respected beyond any other single document, don't forget, was that the Magna Carta enshrined the rights of commoners and the rights to access the commons. And the Charter of the Forest was the part that was taken out of the original document. We all got taught in school that the Magna Carta was signed by King John and the barons and Runnymede in June 1215. That is wrong. It was not accepted and it didn't become the Magna Carta until 1217. And the parts that had originally been in the Charter of the Liberties, as it was in 1215, became the Charter of the Forest in 1217. They were taken out, expanded. And what the Charter of the Forest did was say, look, ordinary people, commoners, have a right to subsistence and a right to habitat and a right to access resources in the commons. And nobody, including the king, had a right to take from the commons. And that body of law became the constitutional basis of Britain. And ironically, the Charter of the Forest lasted longer on the statute books than any other piece of legislation in history. It was only repealed by a right-wing government in 1971. 1971. And it's been a source of contention, but the Charter of the Forest is a legitimization of the rights of commoners, the rights of you and me to have access to the right to subsistence, the right to freedom. And that goes to the foundation stones of all democracies.
You brought up the enclosure movement a moment ago, which I agree is a miscarriage of injustice. There were, I'm recording to you while I'm in Scotland, the Highlands were just liquidated. People's houses were burned down. Really awful stuff happened. Also, a handful of people could make a bunch of money on stuff that they had nothing to do with. But then I flash forward to, say, like the Soviet Union and collectivized agriculture, which was disastrous and led to famine. Would you look at that collectivized agriculture as the state plundering the commons, or just the commons as agriculture done poorly? Or how would you interpret that based on your framework?
Yeah, certainly, without a doubt. This was state plundering of the commons. But if you look back historically, the state, whatever the state might be at the time, which in any country, is always involved in the plunder of the commons. What happened in the Soviet system and what happened in China was a particularly virulent form of state extraction from the commons. The irony is that both state communism and neoliberal capitalism were doing the same thing, justifying taking the commons. But the commons has always been providing an informal system of social protection, an informal system of social solidarity, an informal base of a good society. It plays a role in actually facilitating a market system because it gives an underbelly of protection and conviviality and sharing. And it's not alien to a decent market economy, okay? It is alien to a state-dominated paternalism, however it's dressed up, whatever people might think, but it's not alien to freedom. On the contrary, you cannot have freedom unless you have a commons. You cannot have democracy unless you have a commons. And for me, this is a base for a new progressive politics for the 21st century. We need to revive the commons. A proper place for a market system, a proper place for the state. We always need a state of some sort, I believe, and a proper place for people's freedom and equality and conviviality and nurturing nature. Because the commons actually emphasize we as humans are part of nature. Nature is part of us, and the commons is a way of bringing that together, whereas a pure market system, where dominated by finance, is wanting to deplete resources, maximize growth, short-term profit maximization. A state system is likely to have no respect for freedom. And this commons is actually a way of building a new progressive politics consistent with allowing a market economy to focus on what it should be focusing on, which is producing goods that people want, services that people want, and being rewarded for taking risks in that regard, but not benefiting purely from taking property. And that, I'm afraid, is rentier capitalism. I've discussed it in my books, which is what we've got today.
You're blowing my mind. I, as somebody that's very much been looking at most of politics as a battle between the state and the private sector, having this third place that you're describing is very interesting to me. And I want you to elaborate a little bit on state paternalism, because in my experience, everybody that I would describe as a statist or anybody fighting the neoliberals in America, I find tends to be a paternalist. And you have a quote in your book: "State paternalism took over the social security functions of the commons, and the class-based defense of the commons waned and almost died." Now, in my older model, that doesn't make any sense to me, because the state is welfare, the state is all these things, and you while simultaneously sounding a bit commie to me, are also sounding anti-state paternalism. So I want you to kind of unpack this for me so I can understand what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm strongly against state paternalism. I'm against paternalism of any sort. In that sense, I'm closer to the libertarian position. For me, what had happened in the 20th century, right from late in the 19th century, is that you had two tendencies. One was to say that only labor counts as work, and therefore we will reward labor, but other forms of work like caring for people, commoning, various forms of community activity are somehow not counted as work. That was a 20th century form of what I call laborism. And the irony was that the people advocating industrial capitalism were saying this because they wanted everybody possible to be laboring to help in their profit making. But at the same time, the state communists were saying, yes, everybody should be laboring, and if you're not laboring, you're parasitic. So they had a combination where they were promoting pure laboring. So you got rewards if you labored. If you didn't labor, you got punished, right? And this went into an ideology of saying, yes, you're productive if you're doing jobs. You're not productive if you're not in jobs. And that led to the development of welfare systems which were tied to the performance of labor. If you were performing labor in full-time stable jobs, you could get access to social securities, unemployment benefits, maternity benefits, etc., right? If you weren't doing labor, then you didn't have entitlement to that. So we have a system that developed through the 20th century where the work done by women, in particular, more work spent on care, was treated as non-work. Non-work. And in fact, it went further than that. It said you should be moving as fast as possible into jobs. So that delegitimized care, community work, voluntary work, ecological work. None of those counted. And the paternalism went even further with saying, okay, we're going to design our welfare systems such that you're incentivized to take labor, you're punished if you don't take labor. And this is for your own good. Not proven, it's purely a claim. Okay? And the paternalism went even further in the United States and in Britain and elsewhere, so I don't want to imply that it was only the United States, with the Welfare Reform Act of Clinton in 1996. You'll remember, he said, we'll end welfare as we know it. A terrifying phrase. Because what happened was that the trend to workfare was vastly strengthened. Workfare is the following. The development of welfare systems has involved a shift to means testing. Means testing means you will only get a benefit if you are poor. So we target the benefits on those who are poor. This means we have to measure whether you are poor or not. But then someone says, yeah, but supposing Jane or Joan or John is poor because they're lazy. Okay, why should they get benefits? So they then have to have behavior tests to determine whether, in fact, you have made the requisite efforts to get a job. Paternalistic increases. Then you have to say, well, what counts as making an effort? And then you have to say, well, what happens when you have a means-tested system, paternalistic in its design, and what happens if somebody goes from low benefits that they finally got obtained into a low-wage job? They lose the benefits and they get a little extra, which means no incentive. So that the government then has to say, okay, we have to force people to take those jobs because they haven't got an incentive to take it. It's called the poverty trap. Now, every government has moved in that direction, and we have a huge precariat, of which I've written a lot, and we have a situation where millions and millions of Americans, British people, and said who are being punished, losing benefits, losing entitlements, being stigmatized, or being so fearful that they don't even apply for benefits. This system is impoverishing millions of people. It's creating second or third class citizens. I call them denizens, because they're losing social rights. And they're losing access to the commons. The great thing about the commons as a way of thinking is that it gives people entitlement to what is part of our social framework, fabric. And it builds protection into respect for different people's particular circumstances and ways of life. And that mutual respect strengthens the drive to work, the drive to be responsible, the drive to avoid criminality, etc. But if you denude the society of your commons, then people become opportunistic, produce series of moral hazards and immoral hazards. So the state becomes even more intrusive and move from paternalistic to the state, a panopticon state, which Jeremy Bentham designed in 1798, where we all fear the state looking at us and penalizing us. And now through algorithms and so on, it becomes much worse. And the state, don't forget, is not something alien to capitalism. Capitalism needs the state, but a particular type of state. The state isn't just a blank, okay? And that's why I think the dualism of state versus market is nonsense. Rentier capitalism requires a strong state, but a state that's alien to what we should be concerned with.
So theoretically, if I wanted to scrap a lot of the alphabet agencies in the United States that are metering out money based on particular things and allocating tax dollars to particular citizens, just scrap that, and let's say the top 5% of everybody's income is put in a big pot and it's divided evenly between all Americans, that would be kind of an economic version of the commons?
I don't like the possible interpretation of that, Andrew, in the sense that I do believe we need a proper functioning state. And I don't want to be ushering in a sort of an excuse for extreme right-wing libertarians who want to dismantle the state and basically leave everybody in the hands of the goodwill or otherwise of the powerful in society. I think a state has to be orchestrating public education. It has to be building and preserving social infrastructure, civil liberties, legal systems, which are part of the commons, and so on. So I think what is needed is a move away from a paternalistic directive form of state. And that has been a big theme of my new books, The Politics of Time, because in the building up of that paternalistic structure I've just been talking about, the time of people in the precariat, the time of millions of Americans and others, is taken for granted and abused. And I believe that abuse is one of the worst forms of inequality in modern society. And I think that we need a conscious effort to emancipate people's time, and that requires certain types of state apparatus, which it should be non-paternalistic in the sense of shouldn't be telling people what to do and what not to do and punishing people if they behave in a way that you and I might not like. As long as it's within the law, then that should be accepted. So I think that is a message I would wish to convey. I think removing the incredible apparatus that has been built up. If someone wants to apply for something in California, they have to fill in hundreds of pages of forms and things like that. This is absurd. It's gone way beyond any sensible thing. But I think a commons stems from principles of how to live a convivial, ecological, sustainable society. And that is what I think we should be focusing on.
Interesting. Well, I want to come to what the modern application of that would be in a British or American context momentarily. But before we do so, I want to make sure I understand a couple of other core concepts that you outline in the book. You had mentioned earlier on in our conversation right to roam.
Yeah.
And you mentioned usufruct rights in the book multiple times. Are there? I'm thinking of this almost as like a pie chart of what property, who owns what property, but it seems to me that there's almost like social commons rights that you would layer on top of other forms of property. So right to roam, you own your yard, but we sort of all agree that I'm allowed to cross your yard or something like that. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think the right to roam is a very good example. We have a situation in Britain and in other countries where the gradual privatization or enclosure of the seashore and river shores has meant that people are denied the right to roam along large stretches of the sea or large stretches of rivers or lakes. The right to roam was a keen part of the commons going right the way back through history. And I think that that's been accepted as a principle, but it needs legislation to make sure that those rights are preserved and are not encroached by powerful interests or whatever, and that both sides are able to understand what counts as a commons and what doesn't count for a commons. So there are many examples, and the right to roam is a good... The use of rights means that I have the right to use a piece of land in producing, say, vegetables or whatever it might be, with an allotment, or victory gardens, as they've sometimes been called. But I have a duty to respect that this is a commons to be preserved and pass on. I would be failing to respect the usufruct rights if I depleted that land and abused it and did whatever it was to destroy its natural base. And a usufruct rights is something that I respect because I live on a stream and I can have access to the land around the stream, but I don't have the ownership of that land. I have to respect that it belongs equally to everybody else so they can walk up the stream and admire and use the nature in it as long as they respect the principles that I outline in the book.
Okay, I think I understand this. So my family has this old lake house in Wagner, Oklahoma, and it's on Lake Fort Gibson. I actually don't know who owns Lake Fort Gibson. I always just sort of assume the state owns it. Let's assume the state owns it. But when I visit my lake house, I don't own the lake. I have we own zero part of that water, but I'm permitted to go fishing on it. Right. So I have a usufruct right to go fishing on that body of water. But were I to abuse that to the point where I was trying to fish every single fish in the lake, I would be exceeding the bounds of that usufruct right.
Correct. Well, I can give you a much bigger example that in 1982, with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that I mentioned earlier, we had the biggest enclosure in history. And that enclosure turned the seabed around every country with coasts up to 200 nautical miles. It became state property. It became, instead of a commons, it became owned by the governments of the countries. So the United States got legal entitlement to 11.4 million square kilometers outside its coast. Britain got 6.8 million square kilometers. France did best of all. Now, that was an act of enclosure which has unfortunately allowed governments to privatize access to the assets in the sea. And that includes a fish. And that has led to the development of catch share systems in the United States, quota systems in Britain and elsewhere, where literally turning a certain percentage of the fish population become private property of the owners of the quota. And the quota happens to be given to a few powerful corporations. This is a plunder of the commons, creating a private property right, which is the privilege of a few. It's literally a statutory created privilege of an elite minority. This is completely amoral in my view, and it's taking from the cons. The same we're having this week that I am talking to you. There's a big debate. I've contributed articles in the newspapers because I'm worried that deep sea mining is about to be allowed to take off for the benefit of a few corporations, when the whole commons principles means that the benefits of any minerals or whatever in the deep sea should belong to all of us. All of us. And therefore, this is a private resource grab that is about to take place. And I'm extremely worried because the ecological damage of deep sea mining is frightening. That will release carbon, that will do damage to marine species of enormous quantities, and cause many other problems that will come from it. And we, the commoners, will be losing as a result of that, and it will contribute to global warming and so on. So it's all linked. And if you regard things as a commons, then the balance is not lost. And that is so important.
Let's talk about those minerals then for a minute. I have a soft spot for Margaret Thatcher. She very much comes off as a villain in your book, but I've been raised on Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell and so forth, and I'm very partial to their economics. So I don't like command economies, and I generally find governments inefficient. That said, you make a good case that when Thatcher privatized the North Sea oil for the United Kingdom, that she could have gone a different route, like Norway. That Norway, rather than selling off their oil and then just giving it back to everybody one time as taxes, they've created a sovereign wealth fund that all Norwegians have. So, how did Norway approach this differently, and what would that look like in an American or British context if we'd approached our resources as Norway does?
Well, I regard what Thatcher did with North Sea oil as one of the biggest economic crimes by any modern government. What they did was they privatized access to great parts of the North Sea, or the Scottish Sea if you're a Scot, and allowed multinational corporations to have access to the oil. They even gave them subsidies. And they took a windfall gain, which they used to make tax cuts for the wealthy and to pay for unemployment benefits. So it was an act which has ironically led to the situation where today large parts of our North Sea is controlled by Chinese state capital because they've taken over the ownership. And so you have an ironic situation where we've given away our commons and are now seeing foreign capital dominating. Is that what an American would have liked to happen? I hope not. Meanwhile, the Norwegians had said, look, the oil and gas in our part of the North Sea is part of our commons. It should be kept in the ownership of our society, and we will, in effect, rent out to multinational oil companies the capacity to make money and to produce and sell their oil and gas, but they have to pay the royalties to Norway. And Norway's built up this wonderful fund, a capital fund, a sovereign wealth fund, if you like, which today is worth well over $1 trillion. And what they've done is they've incorporated commons principles. They've made an investment strategy that invests in ecologically sustainable industries around the world, and they've built up the fund. And as the fund goes up, the returns to the investment can be distributed in whatever way the Norwegians decide. Had Britain done the same thing, it would have had a bigger commons capital fund today. And what the fund could have done is that as you build it up, dividends could be paid out to all citizens. And my calculations show that you could be paying a decent common dividend to every British person living in Britain that would make them anything but poor. It would be a return on public wealth, and it would give security and a sense of freedom to everybody. Instead of which, we have chronic inequalities, chronic insecurities, a huge collapse of people's security, and so on. So it's a very big missed opportunity. The nearest thing in the United States was, of course, the Alaska Permanent Fund.
I was about to say, this sounds very much like the Alaska Permanent Fund to me, yeah.
Now, the Alaska Permanent Fund, when it was first established by someone who had joined our network, incidentally, that he was the governor and he joined our basic income networks, as did your friend Milton Friedman, by the way. He said,
Was it Mike Gravel? Was it Mike Gravel?
What? Sorry?
Was it Mike Gravel, Governor Gravel?
No.
From Alaska?
Jay, I know his name is Jay. I'll think of the name in a moment. But
wait, did you say Milton Friedman? He joined your network?
Yes, he did.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, he did. He joined our network and he wrote to us, I remember, saying why he'd come round to supporting a basic income. He realized that you can't have a good market society, a market economy, unless people can make choices. And you can only make choices if you have access to material resources to give you a sense of freedom to choose. I argue for a basic income on other reasons as well, but I think I can respect that. And he came round to that perspective. What we've had is the opposite, because let me finish with the Alaska Permanent Fund first, though. The Alaska Permanent Fund was set up by Jay Hamming, something like that. I beg his memory for not remembering his name right offhand. And it was set up in 1976 and started paying out dividends, permanent dividends, in 1982, when the fund had built up, taking the royalties from the oil found in Alaska. And it was built up to the point where every Alaskan citizen was receiving over $2,000 a year as a dividend. And it was extremely popular. Unfortunately, Republican governors came in and slashed the ordinary taxes for state spending to zero. And as a result, they didn't have the resources to maintain education, infrastructure, etc., etc. So they plundered the fund in order to fill a fiscal gap. And that is a failure of respecting the commons. The commons should be for commoners. The fiscal policy should be for whatever state functions are democratically determined, and the voters can make up their mind which party to choose, and that is part of state policy. Fair enough. But the commons have to be preserved as a commons, and this failure has led to huge hiatus in Alaskan politics over the last few years, but the common dividend and the fund have been extremely popular in Alaska and actually resulted in Alaska moving from the most unequal state in the Union to being the one with the least income inequality in the Union. And that, I think, was a fantastic achievement.
Wonderful. And this is also a good delineation of what we were discussing earlier. So the state action, the state realm, would be the fiscal realm of taxes and spending, and that's determined through the democratic process. But the resources come from taxes. The spending is done through the state mechanisms. Where the commons here is the dividend that you're describing. So that's just the natural resources of Alaska or Norway, or in an alternate universe, the North Sea in the United Kingdom. That is the commons, and just everybody gets a paycheck from it. It's not that the state uses it as a slush fund and says, we're going to subsidize engineering degrees this year, and we're going to subsidize barley, and we're going to figure out how to allocate this according to our dictums. Rather, just everybody gets a cut.
Yeah, I think that the point about this, Andrew, is the commons is something that belongs to all of us as equals. I am not superior to you. You are not superior to me. We are all equals. And this means that we have to act in respect of the public trust doctrine and this principle of intergenerational equity. And what that means is that a commons must be seen as something to pass on to our children and grandchildren and future generations in as good a condition as we found them when we became the dominant commoners. And this means that in something like minerals or oil, then you've got to preserve the capital value, even if you're depleting the oil or mineral base, but you must retain the value to be passed on to future generations. That is why the royalties or the rents from the taking of the commons must be put into this fund, and only the returns to the investment of those funds can be recycled in dividends. And this leads to a very important principle which I advocate in my books, which is that there are different forms of commons, different forms of common resources. Some commons resources, such as the ones we've just been talking about, are exhaustible. In other words, if you use them up, they disappear. That's the end of it. Some commons resources are reproducible. They're non-exhaustible. Might include forests that can be replanted but are part of the commons. It might include use of land that can be reproduced in good form. Those that revenue can be recycled to the extent of leaving only enough to replenish the resources. But there are also another form of commons. The air, for example, is part of our commons. It belongs to all of us. It may seem strange to think that. The same with water. Water belongs to all of us. And if a commercial or other state activity pollutes the air or pollutes the water or takes away our natural environment, then those doing so owe a compensation to the commoners. And then that's why I think a modern commons capital fund should include rental income from people who benefit from taking the land or the sea or whatever it might be, but also a tax or a levy on those who are using our commons for their benefit, but causing harm to the rest of us. That's why I strongly believe in a carbon levy. Carbon levy, which is a tax on carbon dioxide and other forms of pollution to the air. That's why I believe in various other levies that I propose in the books that are penalizing those people who are taking from the commons, not paying the full costs of production, but are imposing those costs on the community and on nature. And I think that leads to a set of levies that I proposed in the books, which is an eco-fiscal strategy for preserving the commons and building up commons fund, which is perfectly consistent with a market economy, and common dividends paid as the commons fund rises. Common dividends, another name for a basic income.
You know, what I find fascinating about everything you're describing is I think we're coming from very, very different ideological places. I'm coming from this Milton Friedman classical liberal perspective that I think would broadly be considered neoliberal that you roundly villainize in your book. You're coming from a different perspective. That being said, though, I don't like the idea of being fiscally punitive to people based on their labor, their ideas, or their output. I don't have any problem with Elon Musk or somebody becoming successful due to something that they build up. So I would rather that there be a dividend paid to everybody to increase individual autonomy, and that it be funded through natural resources that nobody really deserves credit for, or through negative externalities. And it seems like we have this kind of Georgist overlap we can both operate in.
Well, let me disabuse you a little bit, Andrew.
Good, okay.
I will, in my books, I make the claim, which I hope I demonstrate in a book called The Corruption of Capitalism. And I say in that book that, ironically, the reforms unleashed by Thatcher and Reagan and Milton Friedman and others in the Chicago School in the 1980s, in the name of a free market system, have turned out to create the most unfree market economy ever conceived. We don't have a free market economy. And we have a system in which the Elon Musks and the Bill Gates of the world are earning millions times more than they would have done if a free market economy had existed. That is a lot more than their predecessors, who may have made just as strong innovations and so on. And the main reason for that was that in 1994, the World Trade Organization, well, it wasn't the World Trade Organization then, it became the World Trade Organization, passed what's called TRIPS, Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. And what this has done is strengthened enormously the system of patents and copyright. Now, if you file a patent on any idea, you get automatically a monopoly profit. Nobody else can make money from that for 20 years. In pharmaceuticals, it may be extended to 40 years, as I show. And what we've seen in the last 30, 40 years is an extension to the point where we now have 16 million patents in operation. And the big shots, when they become big shots and use finance, they can do what's called hoovering of patents. So they buy up patents.
Or what would we call patent trolls in the States? That's
right. And patent trolls means that they can string together a set of patents and turn an income flow that would be several billion into an income flow that would be many billions. Now, you have this simply because of a non-market mechanism that has been introduced to vastly strengthen private property rights relative to a market system. Now, many patents are taken out merely to stop other people producing something. And many patents are taken out even though the funding of the research that led to the filing of the patent is paid by ordinary taxpayers like you and me. Okay? And that included the vaccines that have been with COVID. Most of the funding and the risk-taking was taken by the public, not by Pfizer or some of the other companies. And this is extensively showing that you're taking the plunder of the intellectual commons. Ideas flow. Jefferson famously said it's offensive to privatize ideas. Ideas belong to everybody. And each person who comes along makes a pebble of a contribution to a Gibraltar of knowledge in their particular sphere. So to say that Bill Gates deserves all the benefit because he's the last person to put the last pebble in a whole series of brilliant inventions is quite honestly offensive. But it's much too strong. You don't need patents because the research, and as I've shown in the book, the research shows that they don't encourage more innovation, more risk-taking. On the contrary, they don't. And they don't increase economic growth. There is no evidence to support that claim, which is made by the people who are making all the money from it. It's a system of boondoggling. And that, I'm afraid, is where we are today. We don't have a free market economy. If that system is overarching our economic system, where you provide a monopoly profit to one person or one company, that's ridiculous. That's not free market. That's not free market. And libertarians should be championing a reform of the intellectual property rights system.
I don't know that we really disagree on this, to be honest with you. My problem when I talk to people that I would describe as statists or progressives or something like that, their attitude tends to be, if you made a lot of money, it had to be exploitative, therefore we should take their money. And I disagree with that. If you're able to create a lot of value,
I'm not disagreeing with that either.
Oh, no, I agree. I feel like what you're saying, and I think that we actually share a common intellectual framework here, is you're basically saying, I don't like rent-seeking at an intellectual level. And you're saying that the patent system is effectively rent-seeking.
Yeah, and not only the patent system, there are huge subsidies that the state provides these people who make they're part of the plutocracy. What I think is quite wrong, if if an Elton John or any particular favorite of yours or mine makes a lot of money from their concerts and selling their music, I think that's fair game. Where I find myself very uncomfortable is the very fact that the money that somebody like that can make enables them to become billionaires because they can invest that money and make vast amount of money. And that, they can just stop producing music, and the money that they've saved becomes a multiple because the financial system is rewarding the ownership of financial property much more than it used to. That I find difficult to justify on any moral or economic grounds. I think if someone is paid for the risk they take, the effort they put in, the entrepreneurship that they show, that's one thing. That's all very good. And we need that in a healthy economy. Where I part grounds with anybody who tries to defend the modern system of rentier capitalism is that the returns to property have gone up disproportionately, whereas the returns to people who do work and labor have gone down. That's why talk about the functional distribution of income in the technical sense, where the share going to the owners of property has gone up and up and up. Not because they're proven to be much more clever or hardworking or whatever it might be than their predecessors, but simply because the architecture of the system is rewarding the ownership of property. And it's disproportionate, it's got completely out of control. Property gets huge subsidies. Billions of dollars every year is given out in subsidies which tend to go to the very wealthy. This is a nonsensical system.
This would be like, I'm not as familiar with the United Kingdom, but in the United States, part of the reason that property is such a good investment is because we have a number of regulatory rules that have minimum lot zoning sizes that make sure that the property value is maintained, even if you wanted to subdivide it to make more houses. And then in terms of farming, we have very large subsidies that go out in agriculture, but it's not per farmer, it's per acreage. So if you're a large company that owns a bunch of land, you get a bunch of money. And in the United Kingdom, you guys have like literal lords that inherited all of the land from the enclosure movement. Are those the dudes getting the subsidies?
Oh, yeah, they get vast subsidies. I mean, I give the example in the book of the Duke of Buccleuch. I love his name, who inherited 277,000 acres of prime land across the country simply because he's the 10th descendant of an illegitimate child of King Charles II. And to add to his fortune each year, he receives a huge government subsidy to enable him to maintain the land. Well, I think that's ridiculous. He's received millions and millions of pounds from successive British governments. But in the United States too, the system has insured property owners, but not insured people who don't have property and who are taking risks in their lives and have to take risks all the time. I think it's the worst case is the system which says that if a corporation is producing and a government introduces changes which could affect their future profits, then the company can sue the government. And this system has allowed multinational corporations to sue governments and force governments into not making changes because they're fearful of that. And it means that they're insured, but I'm not insured. If a government makes a change and introduces a new tax or a new system that lowers my income, I can't sue the government for lowering my future income. But a corporation can do that, which is asymmetrical and is inconsistent with common justice.
Fascinating. Well, I've got a couple more questions, then I'll let you go. You make a tantalizing reference in your book that I want you to elaborate on a little bit, because you mentioned that in Italy there are 14,000 social cooperatives, and you filed that under the category of commons. What is a social cooperative? What do they do?
Well, the social cooperative is a particular form of commons, and I discuss similar cooperatives in terms of taking place around the world in coastal communities. And the essence of a commons is to allow all stakeholders, all interests, but dominated by those who have most to lose from the depletion of the commons, to be part of the governance. In principle, and I'm not saying that this has been always the case, a cooperative enables every interest group to have a voice, and a voice that is that substantive voice, which counts. It doesn't allow a particular interest to have domination over everybody else. The biggest fear I have in the moment, not only fear, but I've documented it in the books, is domination by private equity finance. Private equity finance buys up company, buys up care homes, buys up part of education, and they exist to maximize the returns to their members in the shortest time possible. So they indulge in asset stripping, depletion of the commons, and then declare bankruptcy, get tax breaks for declaring bankruptcy, as many companies, many private equity funds are doing in the United States and elsewhere, and then move out. No social responsibility towards people, the communities, reproduction of the commons, and so on. A cooperative has certain problems, but at least starts from the premise that everybody's interest should be taken into account, not in a wishy-washy way, corporate social responsibility claims, blue-washing, greenwashing, or whatever, but in a sense where deliberative democracy can be developed. And I'm very strongly in favor of forms of deliberative democracy, because that is the only way to respect the long-term sustainability of the commons.
I would be remiss if I did not ask you about the tragedy of the commons and the idea that when everyone owns a thing, no one's truly responsible of it, and thus if the predominant model is private property, everybody has skin in the game and maintains it better. How do you respond to that?
Well, the man who wrote that article gets my blood pressure up very, very quickly. He was a eugenicist and he was a racist. He was a white supremacist. And he wrote a companion to his article, The Tragedy of the Commons, which was called The Lifeboat Ethics. And he said, basically, the world is full. Our world is full. And therefore, we must not let anybody else onto our lifeboat, because we'll all sink. And therefore, we have to build up barriers and keep them out. He even was against the development of food aid, because he thought that would, he was pure Malthusian. He thought that would lead to more population and therefore a threat to us, him being the embodiment of a white perspective. That was his explicit views. And of course, later in life, he realized that what his article had been fallacious about is misunderstanding the difference between open access. In other words, literally, anybody can have access and you can use it as much as you like, to a commons. And Elinor Ostrom and others, including, I hope, myself, have been pointing out that a commons requires a governance system that prevents precisely the things he said was the part of the commons. It wasn't part of the commons. We really should be talking about the tragedy of decommoning, the tragedy of losing the commons, and therefore private property being allowed to maximize the use of resources or whatever. We need a system of saying, you've got to respect the precautionary principle, you've got to preserve the principles of the commons, to preserve the value and pass them on to future generations. And that is a profoundly different way of looking at it. He was, I'm sorry, a disgrace.
Excellent. And then final question for you. In researching your book, some of the criticisms that I've read about your perspective are that either you are you were basically looking to bring in communism under the guise of something which is traditional, or alternately, you were looking to bring back feudal collectivism minus the lords. How would you respond to any such criticisms?
Well, I think these name-calling things are stupid. We need a new language for progressive thinking that goes beyond the stupid positions of a lot of people in the last century. I don't think using the term communism or whatever is helpful. I don't actually believe in strong state control. I believe in systems in which freedom and equality can be pursued, and that everybody has an equal status, an equal sense of dignity, an equal right to subsistence, an equal right to have access to a habitat. And these are why I support a basic income and have lobbied for basic income and indulged in pilots around the world, done pilots to see how they work. And I believe that this is extending common justice, extending freedom, and giving people a fundamental basic security without which none of us can function. And the experiments that we've done show that it increases work, it increases production, it reduces income inequality, it reduces inflation, contrary to a lot of the prejudice about basic income. And I'm very pleased to know that as we speak, there are over 100 experiments going on, many in the United States, that are generating a wonderful new body of heart-rending evidence. I'm advising the Welsh government on a big pilot for care leavers, for example, the Barcelona government and so on, that are showing that people who have basic income become more productive, more civilized, more tolerant, more altruistic, less likely to indulge in extremism of any type, particularly the populism represented by the likes of Trump and Boris Johnson and so on. So I'm in a sense optimistic, but going into this with a commons perspective is a way, I think, of generating a new progressive politics that the young in particular, the young recognize the ecological challenges. And that's why my new book on the politics of time is basically an ecological agenda, but basic income is part of it.
Dr. Standing, I have greatly enjoyed speaking to you. This has been so much fun, and I would love for you to come back on sometime to discuss your forthcoming book, or for that matter, anything else you'd like. You're a very interesting chat that's making me think, so thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, as they say. Cheers.
Good chat with Dr. Standing, huh? I would have loved to have spoken more with him, but alas, we ran out of time. I had a lot of questions. I even had some things to argue with him about. But we just had so much to cover this episode. We didn't do it. Fortunately, the conversation continues on this week's bonus episode, wherein my friend Lawrence joins me to assess the concept of the commons, objections to the commons, and even makes a rational argument that is rapacious and unethical as the enclosure movement was. Still a pretty good idea. You can find that by heading over to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton for a bonus episode entitled Rebuttal to the Commons. I do want to temper your expectations a little, because Lawrence and I recorded that episode after we came directly from the pub. And so I'm a little squiggly. We definitely talk about the commons, but also I'm a bit drunk in this week's bonus episode. So we go off on a tangent about Margaret Thatcher and unions. At one point, I think we talk about housing policy, something called the Ghent system, and float a theory that the British Conservative Party has no ideological core, but is in fact a proceduralist vehicle. Again, just a little drunk in this week's bonus episode. I would never do that on the main feed. That would be very disrespectful to you, the listener, and it would also be, I think, unprofessional. But the bonus episodes are where I let my hair down. They're the green room. I'm inviting people to hang out in the green room, and it just so happens I'm drunk in the green room. Also, I find that if I've had a few drinks with British people, I kind of embarrassingly sound a little bit British, maybe 5-10% British. I don't think they can hear it, but if my relatives from Alva did, they would be aghast. They would be very disappointed. You know what? If you're not already a patron, just skip this week's bonus episode. Don't forget I even said anything, because it's basically me doing a 2-person tipsy book club with a British person I lured into my flat. Don't worry about it. I'll pitch you next week. People who are already patrons, it's a fun chat, and I think you'll enjoy it. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Guy Standing, for coming on to discuss the Commons. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.